There is a particular kind of exile that doesn't announce itself with shouting or slammed doors. It happens in the small moments. The way conversations shift when you enter a room. The way your truth is always contextualized, explained away, reframed until it no longer resembles what you actually said. The way your memory of events is constantly questioned while everyone else's version is treated as gospel. You weren't cast out because you were difficult. You were cast out because you were accurate. And in families that survive on collective delusion, accuracy is the ultimate transgression. Let's be clear about what scapegoating actually is, beneath the therapeutic language in family systems theory. It's not just being blamed, it's being designated as the container for everything the family cannot face about itself. You become the repository for their shame, their rage, their dysfunction, their contradictions. Not because you generated these things, but because you couldn't pretend they didn't exist. While everyone else was performing normalcy, you were responding to reality. And reality, in these families, is treated like rebellion. You were the child who felt the tension everyone else ignored, who noticed when words didn't match actions, who asked questions that made adults uncomfortable, who showed emotions that weren't convenient, who couldn't fake enthusiasm for family mythology that contradicted your lived experience. This wasn't defiance, it was honesty. But in systems built on agreed-upon fictions, honesty functions as threat, and threats must be neutralized. The scapegoat role doesn't begin with you. It begins with the family's need for one. Every dysfunctional system generates waste, emotional waste, psychological waste, the accumulated pain and shame and unresolved trauma that no one wants to process. In healthy families, this waste is metabolized. People talk about hard things. They acknowledge mistakes. They repair ruptures. The emotional labor is distributed. But in unhealthy families, the waste accumulates, and eventually the system needs somewhere to put it. That's where you come in, not because you're defective, but because you're permeable. You're the one who feels things deeply, who absorbs atmosphere, who can't shut down your emotional awareness even when it would be strategic to do so. You're sensitive, not in the dismissive way the family uses the word, but in the literal sense. Your nervous system is attuned, responsive, capable of registering what others have learned to ignore. This sensitivity makes you useful, because the family needs someone who can feel the unfelt feelings, someone who can express the unexpressed emotions, someone who can embody the dysfunction so everyone else can maintain the illusion of health. You become the identified patient, the problem child, the one whose struggles prove that the family has issues, but whose designation as the troubled one simultaneously proves that the family itself is fine. It's just you. Here's how the logic works, and it's brutally efficient. If you're the only one showing symptoms, then clearly you're the source of the problem. Never mind that you're responding to an environment that would make anyone symptomatic. Never mind that your reactions are proportional to the dysfunction you're embedded in. The family doesn't see cause and effect. They only see your distress. And your distress becomes evidence of your defectiveness, which justifies the scapegoating, which increases your distress, which further proves their point. This is a closed loop, and there's no way to argue yourself out of it. Because the role isn't based on reality, it's based on necessity. The family needs you to be the problem, and your actual behavior, your actual character, your actual truth, none of that matters. What matters is the function you serve, and that function is essential to the system's stability. Let's talk about how the role gets assigned, because it's not random, even though it can feel that way. Scapegoats often believe there's something fundamentally wrong with them that caused the family to reject them, but the selection process is more specific than that. The scapegoat is almost always the family member with the highest emotional intelligence and the lowest tolerance for pretense. Think about your own experience. Were you the child who could read the room before anyone spoke? Who knew when your parent was in a bad mood before they showed it? Who sensed conflict brewing before it erupted? This attunement wasn't a skill you chose to develop. It was a survival adaptation. In unpredictable environments, children become hypervigilant. They learn to track emotional weather because their safety depends on it. But this same attunement that helps you survive also makes you threatening, because you don't just feel the family's emotional reality, you name it. You're the one who asks why everyone's pretending to be happy when they're clearly not. Why the rules change depending on the parent's mood. Why certain topics are forbidden. Why love seems to come with invisible conditions. These questions feel obvious to you. But to the family, they're grenades. Because every question you ask threatens to expose the gap between the family's public image and its private reality. Between who they claim to be and who they actually are. Between the story they tell about themselves and the truth they're desperately avoiding. Your perceptiveness makes that avoidance impossible. And since they can't tolerate the truth, they have to discredit the messenger. This is where gaslighting enters. Not always as deliberate manipulation, though sometimes it is, but as systemic distortion. Your accurate observations are reframed as misperceptions. Your legitimate emotions are pathologized as overreactions. Your truth-telling is recast as troublemaking. The family doesn't engage with what you're saying, they attack your credibility for saying it. And, over time, this makes you doubt your own knowing. You start to wonder if maybe they're right. Maybe you are too sensitive. Maybe you do read too much into things. Maybe your memory is unreliable. Maybe you're making problems where none exist. This self-doubt is the goal. Because a scapegoat who questions their own perception is much easier to control than one who trusts it. The system doesn't just want you to be wrong, it wants you to believe you're wrong, and that's infinitely more effective. There's a particular cruelty in how scapegoating affects your development, because it doesn't just shape how the family sees you, it shapes how you see yourself. The role becomes internalized. You don't just play the scapegoat in family interactions. You become the scapegoat in your own mind. This internalization happens through repetition. Every time you're blamed for something you didn't do, a small deposit is made in your psyche. Every time your pain is minimized, another deposit. Every time your truth is rejected, another deposit. These deposits accumulate, and eventually they form a belief system, a core narrative about who you are. That narrative sounds something like this: I'm the problem. Something is fundamentally wrong with me. I ruin everything I touch. I'm too much and not enough simultaneously. I don't deserve good things. If people really knew me, they'd reject me. Love is something I have to earn through perfect behavior, and I always fall short. This isn't your voice, it's the family's voice. But it's been repeated so many times, internalized so deeply, that it feels like your voice. It feels like truth. And this internalized scapegoating does something devastating. It makes you do the family's work for them. You don't need them to criticize you anymore, because you criticize yourself more harshly than they ever could. You don't need them to reject you because you reject yourself preemptively. You don't need them to question your worth because you've already decided you have none. The system has become self-perpetuating, and they don't even need to be present for it to function. This is why scapegoats often struggle long after leaving the family, because the external scapegoating might have ended, but the internal scapegoating continues. You carry the family's judgment with you. It lives in your inner dialogue. It influences every decision. It sabotages relationships. It prevents you from advocating for yourself, because some part of you still believes that you deserve whatever mistreatment comes your way. Breaking this pattern requires recognizing that the voice isn't yours, that the narrative you've been living inside was constructed by people who needed you to be small so they could stay comfortable, that your self-concept was shaped by a system that had nothing to do with your actual worth and everything to do with its own dysfunctional needs. This recognition is where healing begins, not with changing yourself, but with questioning the story you were told about yourself. Let's examine the mechanics of how the scapegoat maintains family stability, because understanding this removes any remaining doubt about whether you caused your own exile. You didn't. You were structurally necessary. In dysfunctional families, there are multiple roles, and they all work together to maintain equilibrium. There's the golden child, who can do no wrong, Their success proves the family is functional. Their achievements are the family's achievements. They're the proof that the parents did something right. The scapegoat's existence, in contrast, allows the golden child to shine brighter. The worse you look, the better they look. It's a system of contrasts designed to maintain hierarchy. Then there's the lost child, who disappears into the background. They don't cause problems because they're barely noticed. Their invisibility is their survival strategy. They watch the scapegoat get attacked and learn that the safest position is no. Position. Complete self-erasure. The scapegoat's visibility makes the lost child's invisibility possible. There's often an enabler, usually the less dominant parent, who sees the scapegoating happening and does nothing to stop it. They might privately sympathize with you. They might even tell you they understand, but they never intervene publicly. They never challenge the system, because intervening would threaten their own position. Your scapegoating keeps them safe. As long as the family's rage is directed at you, it's not directed at them. And there's the primary aggressor, often a parent with narcissistic traits or unresolved trauma, who needs an enemy to feel powerful, who projects their own inadequacy onto you, who uses you as an emotional dumping ground. Your role as scapegoat allows them to avoid their own pain. As long as they're focused on what's wrong with you, they don't have to face what's wrong with them. All of these roles depend on yours. Remove the scapegoat, and the entire system destabilizes. The golden child loses their contrast. The lost child becomes visible. The enabler has to choose sides. The aggressor has to find a new target or face themselves. This is why families often fight so hard to keep the scapegoat in position. Not because they love you, but because they need you. Your exile would force everyone to renegotiate their roles, and change is terrifying to systems built on rigid dynamics. Here's what makes scapegoating particularly insidious. The family genuinely believes their version of events. This isn't a conspiracy where they secretly know they're wrong but maintain the lie anyway. They actually believe you're the problem. Their denial isn't strategic, it's structural. Their identities depend on it. Think about what it would mean for them to admit the truth. The parent who scapegoated you would have to acknowledge that they harmed their child, that they projected their own pain onto someone smaller and more vulnerable, that they failed in the most fundamental way a parent can fail. The psychological cost of that admission is enormous. It threatens their entire self-concept, so their mind protects them from it. It rewrites history. It distorts memory. It creates a version of events where they're the victim of your dysfunction, not the cause of it. This is why having conversations with them is so futile. You're not just arguing about facts, you're arguing against their psychological survival mechanism. They can't hear you because hearing you would destabilize everything, and humans will defend their identity far more vigorously than they'll defend the truth, especially when the truth is painful. The siblings who went along with your scapegoating, they also believe it, because believing it protects their position. If they admitted you were right, they'd have to acknowledge their complicity. They'd have to recognize that they stood by while you were harmed, that they benefited from your suffering, that they were cowards, that admission is unbearable. So they don't make it. They rewrite their own memories to cast themselves as innocent bystanders or even as victims of your troublemaking. And the golden child, they might need to believe it most of all. Because if you weren't actually the problem, then their golden status wasn't earned. It was arbitrary. They weren't special. They were just compliant. They weren't loved more because they were better. They were rewarded for upholding the family mythology while you were punished for threatening it. That's a devastating realization. So they avoid it. They maintain the belief that you deserved what you got. This collective denial is what makes scapegoating so isolating. You're not just dealing with one person's distortion. You're dealing with an entire system's coordinated reality distortion. Everyone has agreed, consciously or unconsciously, to a version of events that centers your dysfunction, and they reinforce this version with each other. They tell stories about you. They exchange knowing looks when your name is mentioned. They've built an entire shared narrative, and you're the villain in it. Fighting this narrative is like fighting quicksand. The more you struggle against it, the deeper you sink, because every attempt to defend yourself becomes evidence of your defensiveness. Every expression of pain becomes evidence of your emotional instability. Every boundary you set becomes evidence of your cruelty. The system is designed to pathologize your every response, and there's no move you can make within the system that won't be used against you. Let's talk about the moment of awakening, because despite all the gaslighting, despite the internalized shame, despite the family's unified front, something eventually shifts. You start to see the pattern, not just in isolated incidents, but as a structure, a design. You begin to recognize that what happened to you wasn't personal, it was positional. This awakening often happens outside the family system, maybe through therapy, where someone finally reflects back that your reactions were proportional, that your perceptions were accurate, that you weren't crazy. Maybe through a healthy relationship, where you experience being treated with consistent respect and realize how abnormal your family dynamic actually was. Maybe through reading, through finding language for experiences you thought were unique to you. Maybe just through time and distance, where you can finally see the forest instead of just the trees you kept running into. However it happens, the awakening is seismic. Because you're not just learning new information, you're reorganizing your entire understanding of your history. Every memory has to be re-examined. Every story has to be reinterpreted. The narrative you've been living inside, the one where you're fundamentally flawed and everyone else is trying their best with you, that narrative collapses, and what replaces it is more complex, more painful, and infinitely more true. You weren't the problem child. You were the child with problems created by being raised in a dysfunctional environment. You weren't difficult. You were responding to difficulty. You weren't too sensitive. You were appropriately sensitive to a situation that warranted sensitivity. The reframe is total. And it's both liberating and devastating. Liberating because finally, your experience makes sense. The confusion that plagued you for years dissolves. You understand now why trying harder never worked, why being good enough was an impossible standard, why nothing you did changed how they treated you. It wasn't about you. It was never about you. That recognition releases decades of misplaced responsibility. But it's also devastating, because if you weren't the problem, then they were. And accepting that means accepting that the people who were supposed to protect you harmed you instead, that your childhood was stolen, that you were used, that the love you longed for was never actually available no matter how perfectly you performed. This grief is enormous. It's the death of hope. The final letting go of the fantasy that if you could just figure out the right approach, the relationship could be saved. Once you see the pattern, you can't unsee it. And this is where the real work begins, because awareness doesn't automatically equal change. You might understand intellectually that you were scapegoated, but your nervous system is still running old programs. Your body still reacts as if you're in danger when you consider setting a boundary. Your throat still closes when you think about speaking your truth. Your guilt still floods when you imagine disappointing them. This is where the concept of reparenting becomes essential, not as a metaphor, but as a practice. You have to become for yourself what they never were. The parent who believes you, who validates your experience, who protects you, who says that what happened to you was wrong, and you didn't deserve it. And you're not crazy for being hurt by it. This sounds simple, but it's extraordinarily difficult, because you don't have a template. You can't just reverse what they did and call that good parenting. You have to learn from scratch what healthy emotional support looks like, what unconditional acceptance feels like, what it means to have needs and have those needs treated as legitimate rather than burdensome. You start small. When the critical voice in your head says you're worthless, you interrupt it. You question where that voice came from. You recognize it as the internalized family narrative, not as truth. You talk back to it. You offer yourself the compassion they never did. This feels awkward at first, artificial, like you're playing a role. But over time it becomes more natural. The new voice gets stronger, the old voice gets quieter. You also have to grieve, really grieve. Not just the family you lost, but the family you never had, the childhood that should have been yours, the version of yourself that might have existed if you'd been allowed to develop without carrying everyone else's dysfunction. This grief has no timeline. It comes in waves. Sometimes you think you're done with it, and then something triggers it and you're back in it, sobbing for the child who deserved so much better. And you have to get angry, really angry. Not the self-directed anger you've been carrying for years, but the appropriate outward-directed anger at the people who harmed you. This is hard for scapegoats because you were trained to never be angry at them. Anger at the family was forbidden, punished, treated as proof of your dysfunction. So accessing it feels dangerous, but it's necessary because anger is the emotion that says this was wrong. Anger draws boundaries. Anger demands better. Without anger, you stay in a kind of passive acceptance that masquerades as peace but is actually just defeat. Eventually, you reach a decision point. What do you do with this awareness? Do you try to fix the relationship? Do you confront them? Do you maintain minimal contact? Do you leave entirely? There's no right answer. Every option has costs, and no one can make this decision for you. If you try to fix it, you need to accept that the relationship can only change if they're willing to acknowledge the problem. And most scapegoating families aren't. They're too invested in the current narrative, too defended against the truth. So fixing it usually means more of you trying, more of you explaining, more of you compromising, and them staying exactly the same. This can work if you can accept a limited relationship, if you can engage without expecting real intimacy or validation. But it's exhausting, and it requires you to constantly manage your expectations and protect yourself. If you confront them, you need to prepare for the likelihood that they won't hear you, that they'll deny, attack, reverse victim and offender, that your attempt to be honest will be used as further evidence of your dysfunction. Confrontation can be valuable, not because it changes them, but because it gives you the opportunity to speak your truth, to stop carrying it alone, to make the implicit explicit. But it rarely leads to reconciliation. More often, it leads to escalation. If you maintain minimal contact, you need boundaries that are crystal clear and consistently enforced. You need to know exactly what you will and won't tolerate, and you need to be willing to enforce consequences when boundaries are violated. This is a middle path that works for some people. They stay in contact but on their terms. They see family occasionally but protect themselves fiercely. They engage superficially and refuse to go deep. It's a compromise. And like all compromises, it's imperfect. If you leave entirely, if you go no contact, you need to prepare for the guilt, for the social judgment, for the holidays alone, for the grief that comes in waves, for the family members who will pressure you to reconcile, for the culture that will tell you you're wrong. No contact is often the healthiest choice for scapegoats, but it's also the hardest, because it means accepting that the relationship is over, that there will be no reconciliation, that you're choosing yourself over them, definitively and permanently. Whatever you choose, here's what you need to understand. The scapegoat role was never about you. It was about what the family needed you to be, and you can stop being that. You can refuse the role. You can walk away from the script. You can build a life that's yours, not a reaction to them, not organized around proving them wrong, not shaped by their dysfunction, just yours. This doesn't mean the past disappears. It doesn't mean you stop being affected. Scapegoating leaves marks. It shapes how you see yourself, how you relate to others, what you believe you deserve. These patterns don't vanish just because you've achieved awareness. They have to be actively unlearned, and that's lifelong work. But here's what you gain. Freedom, not perfect freedom, not freedom from all pain, but freedom from the specific pain of that role. You're no longer responsible for their emotional regulation. You're no longer the container for their shadow. You're no longer required to be small so they can feel big. You get to be a whole person, complex, contradictory, imperfect, real. And you get to build relationships based on mutuality rather than hierarchy, based on acceptance rather than performance, based on who you actually are rather than who someone needs you to be. You get to discover that not all families work like yours did, that not all love comes with conditions, that not all closeness requires self-erasure. You also get to discover strengths you developed because of the role, your perceptiveness, your emotional intelligence, your capacity to see through bullshit, your resilience, your ability to survive conditions that would have broken others. These aren't things to be grateful for. You shouldn't have needed to develop them, but they're real, and they're yours, and they serve you now in ways the family that forced you to develop them will never understand. The final truth is this: you were not scapegoated because something was wrong with you. You were scapegoated because something was wrong with them, and you couldn't pretend otherwise. Your honesty threatened their denial. Your authenticity exposed their performance. Your emotional reality contradicted their mythology. And rather than question themselves, they questioned you. Rather than change the system, they removed you from it. This was never about your worth. It was about their capacity. And their capacity was limited. Not because they're evil, though some might be, but because they're damaged. Hurt people. Unconscious people unconsciously harm. They were likely scapegoated themselves, or parentified or neglected. They're repeating patterns they never examined, living in stories they never questioned, defending against pain they never processed. Understanding this doesn't mean you have to forgive them. Forgiveness is optional. What's essential is recognizing that their treatment of you wasn't a verdict on your value. It was a reflection of their dysfunction. You were collateral damage in their war with themselves, and while that doesn't make it hurt less, it does make it mean something different. You are not who they said you were. You never were. You were the one who saw too much, who felt too deeply, who refused to participate in the collective delusion, who insisted on truth when everyone else had agreed to the lie. That didn't make you the problem. That made you awake. And awakeness, in sleeping families, is always interpreted as disruption. So if you've left, if you've drawn the boundary, if you've chosen yourself over them, know this: you didn't abandon them. You rescued yourself. You didn't betray the family. You broke free from a role that was killing you. You didn't fail at the relationship failed you, and you finally stopped pretending otherwise. That choice takes courage most people will never have to access. It requires you to stand alone, to trust yourself more than you trust the collective, to value your truth more than you value their approval, to accept exile rather than accept erasure. That's not weakness. That's the opposite of weakness. That's the kind of strength that only comes from having been broken and choosing to rebuild yourself on your own terms. You were always the one who saw. Now you get to be the one who's free.